It seems like only yesterday I had condemned myself to voluntary tutoring in the subject of osmosis, despite that happening in early October, early November. I blinked and suddenly talking about a man who had a genetically modified pig heart inserted into him happened several months ago. In fewer words, I genuinely can't believe that I'm back here, script in hand, ring light blazing, first base studies behind me, and ready to deliver a grandiose, cumulative farewell address. For my base studies trip, I did watershed miniature. It was a trip run by the Sultana Education Foundation that focused on using canoes to paddle around different regions of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. Throughout the week, we covered 5 different locations, going as far north as Kennedyville and as far south as Vienna. While there was always undertones of physicality, it was a lot of the trip zeroed in on using the day's surroundings to illustrate an academic lesson. My most memorable experience of the trip was definitely the last day. After several days of rather intense paddling, it was a welcome break. The process of building a fire, which we all collectively decided to do, was frustrating at times, was very engaging. And another day I really enjoyed was Thursday, where the paddle led us through a wild and unkempt marsh. And specifically that day, I saw some really pretty water lilies whose bright yellow colors contrasted with the comparatively dull colors of the rest of the landscape. And also back to Friday, one of the counselors had a guitar, and so we kind of sat around singing like Taylor Swift for like a good half an hour, which was a very, very fun thing to do. The concepts from our classes I have chosen to scramble and then connect to base studies are as follows. Chapter 3, Communities, Biomes, and Ecosystems. Chapter 5, Biodiversity and Conservation. Chapter 6, Chemistry and Biology. Chapter 8, Cellular Energy. And Chapter 14, The History of Life. Starting off with Chapter 3, Communities, Biomes, and Ecosystems. So the communities we canoed through generally had a somewhat similar makeup. The statement is made under the assumption that community is defined as a collective of interacting populations that occupy a common area simultaneously. While they were all very different, there were some similarities, like the edges of all the bodies of water we paddled through were almost always speckled with trees, deciduous and evergreens included. And of course, the outlier in the similarity were the marsh landscapes that we paddled by, in or around. So those areas were definitely significantly different than the other, like, sort of deciduous evergreen forests that we went through. Speaking of the lands in these kinds of ecosystems, they didn't appear and begin to thrive out of thin air. It can be assumed that the areas we saw hugging the sides of the bodies of water we went through ecological succession, or the process wherein a community replaces another due to altering abiotic or biotic factors. The idea of succession can be elaborated on, and there are 2 types, primary succession and secondary succession. So now I'm going to compare primary succession and secondary succession. So primary succession happens in barren land with no original vegetation, while secondary succession occurs in a region with predisposed amounts of vegetation. And also in primary succession, it's a result of a biological or external factor, wherein like secondary succession is always a result of an external factor. And the most important distinction, at least to me, between these two is that primary succession there is no soil at the start, while in secondary succession perpetually there's soil there. And in primary succession, pioneer species, which are like the first species to kind of break in the succession, kind of catalyze it, they're always non-native, while in pioneer species in secondary succession, there's a much higher chance of them being native to the region, but that doesn't exclude non-native species from immigrating in. And again, another really important and the last distinction between the two of them is because primary succession has to break down and create soil from scratch. It takes significantly longer to completely process through than secondary succession, which is a much shorter process. Well, it's hard to make a concrete connection because a lot of what I did was water-based. To apply this definition to my week of base studies, we're going to go back thousands, possibly millions of years to a hypothetical primary succession where the land around was solid rock. Slowly that rock is infested with lichens, which slowly transition to small amounts of plants appearing. As these organisms die, soil is culminating, which allows grasses and perennials to appear, and these are the primary species in this context. This then leads to more grasses, shrubs, and shade-intolerant trees, which are known as intermediate species. And then a climax community is filled with shade-tolerant trees and those trees at their full maturity. And now onto secondary succession. It's different from primary succession as it takes place in an environment with an established amount of soil, so they're generally a result of a natural disaster, such as a fire. So let's say an environment that we visited was to be caught in lightning by a freak strike of lightning. It would remain barren and burned for several years following that. And it definitely wouldn't stay that way for thousands of years the same way that primary succession would. So slowly species would begin to reappear, or maybe some species would immigrate into that given area. And the first ones would generally be plants, as that kind of attracts animals to come in later on. And then like intermediate species, which are what the animals are, appear later. And like an estimated, like this, it always depends on the like region, but it's maybe 150 so years when the climax community is reached again, as opposed to the thousands of years it takes for primary succession to conclude. You know, all this talk about trees, and we still haven't defined woodlands. Woodlands are land covered in trees and shrubs, characterized by hot and dry summers and cool and wet winters. Another overarching part of this week is definitely climate and weather. So climate is the mean weather conditions in a given region, and that is like inclusive of temperatures and precipitation, while weather is the temporary condition of the atmosphere at a given moment, so weather is more liable to change. And the climate around Maryland is defined by hot and humid summers with cool winters. That's just kind of like a general entire state thing. And the week of Bay studies, the weather conditions were definitely not entirely picture perfect or favorable. Monday's weather was probably the best because it was the sunniest. It was just a little bit breezy, and the skies were pretty clear. Tuesday's weather was too rainy in the morning. That's my understanding because I wasn't there, which led to an impromptu visit to the Sultana building, but then later it cleared up, or I guess it cleared up for the most part, and there was some canoeing down in Radcliffe Creek. And then Wednesday brought on the most wind, which something that severely impeded the speed at which we could canoe. Like traveling across them that should have taken like 15 minutes took like 3 times longer than it should have. And Thursday was pretty calm with the exception of some bouts of wind and like a little bit of light rain, but nothing that lasted too long. Like we were in a marsh, that's kind of to be expected. And then Friday's foreboding skies eventually led to torrential downpour in the early afternoon, but that was after we got back to school, so it was a-okay. Now it's time to connect the most relevant section, which is why I chose this entire chapter in the first place, and that is aquatic ecosystems. We'll start with defining wetlands as expansive lands utterly saturated with water and are able to support some aquatic plant life. And these are places like marshes, swamps, and bogs. And this is exactly what our Thursday paddle took us like straight through. Then we came to possibly one of the biggest unspoken concepts of the entire week, and that is that of an estuary, or the ecosystem that forms as freshwater rivers or streams merge with the ocean. Living around here, you hear a statistic that's absolutely exhausted, which is that the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States, which is true. And it's a gigantic formation, obviously, seeing as it basically slices the state in half, or nearly does, and runs like veins on a plant leaf like through the entire state. But what plays a role in how exactly water got to flow the way it does now? Well, here's a list. The slope of the land affects it, as well as the amount of sediment carried and deposited by fast water. The wind stirring up and adding oxygen to the water definitely has a large effect on it, and erosion. All of these factors contributed to the unique states of all the regions that we went through, and it is worth noting that the exception to the inevitable rip current that was in all of these places, the water we canoed through was very calm and therefore rich with all sorts of life, as life can't really be sustained in very fast moving water. You thought I was done with statistics because it's a biology class and not AP statistics? Think again, statistics are absolutely and completely unavoidable. And here are some statistics in the marine ecosystems branch. So as I said earlier, more life is living in calmer water as opposed to fast flowing rivers. And our world's water is 97.2% salt and 2.5% fresh water. 68.9% of that fresh water comes from glaciers, 30.8% comes from groundwater, and the final 0.3% comes from lakes and rivers. So really not that much in comparison. And the last point I want to make is that marine algae's hefty consumption from CO2 in the atmosphere, it releases a lot of oxygen. We traveled to all regions of the bay and its tributaries, and that consequently was leading us through freshwater, brackish water, and saltwater. If I remember correctly, day 1 in Turner's Creek was the freshest water we went through, as it was the farthest north, and I didn't conduct enough salinity tests or swallow gallons of river water, I'd like to live out the rest of my life without mad cow disease or whatever that disease is called. So I cannot speak for the salinity of all the other bodies of water we went through, but that's just the one that I remember off the top of my head. And now we're on to the next chapter, which is chapter 5, biodiversity and conservation. So now there's a whole hullabaloo about biodiversity. Two things. What is biodiversity and why should we care about it so much? Especially around here, you can't walk into any cute little town without being force-fed facts about the bay, which of course bleeds into biodiversity. So to answer my own rhetorical question, biodiversity is the vast array of life in a singular area that is dictated by the numbers of different species in that area. Hold your horses, we're going to answer that second question later. I just don't have the strength to do it right now because it overlaps with ethics and the economy. Two more worthwhile definitions I want to go over. So the first one is extinction, or when the last organism in a population dies and therefore the population is wiped out entirely. And then there's genetic diversity, defined as the variety of genes present in a population. Both of these terms have relevance in this context. So evolution has its nature's threat and promise to maintain a sort of proportion control of what we take and give and take too much of out of the environment. So once a species, once a species is gone for good, it's gone for good. Genetic diversity is a catalyst for the unique areas around us. Without it, specifically in the context of this area, a lot of individuality of the area would not be fostered. This is also due to the fact that some species around here could be endangered or in need or have federal protection already bestowed upon them. Invasive species also factor into this, and there's certain species like some kinds of catfish or phragmites which steal resources from competitive areas and effectively accelerate the chances of native species going extinct. Finally, let's answer the question, what's the point of biodiversity? Never knowing the value of a species that it may have later on. For instance, we only discovered aspirin because it came from willow, or we discovered penicillin because it came from moldy bread. Also, it factors into the economy as some solutions can be traced back to aquatic ecosystems that could turn out to be cheaper in the long run. It also allows for more of a stable economy when it comes to agriculture and the fishing industry. Agriculture is super prevalent and vital around here, and without a diverse array of crops, the soil falters. Also, in terms of fishing, having a diverse ecosystem full of different species of fish can directly correlate to the economy, seeing as a lot of very long family lines rely on fishing as a source of income. At almost every single location we went to, unless it was a private beach, it was very, very apparent that that was true, because it was always something along the lines of us examining fishing nets or crab nets that people were using to try and, catch fish and crabs, or it was just seeing people unloading their fishing boats full of cargo that they had caught that day. Well, it's never good to focus on just the negatives of anything in any context. I actually vividly remember a counselor or a leading conversation where he pointed out that a lot of people just see the failures of the bay and not the successes, which that conversation is going to come back a lot, so just kind of keep that in your mind. It's important to bring that up, especially in the context of the bay. And for this, I'm going to have to define another word, which is natural resources. And they are a collection of materials and organisms that are within the parameters of the biosphere, which is obviously a very large pool to grab from. And things that come to mind immediately are lumber and fish, as those are something that are readily available around here. And all of the places we went, this is another point that's going to come up a lot because something that was really clearly driven home to us was that we went to a lot of places that were very raw and untouched by humans, which were rich in a variety of natural resources. Overexploitation, or the egregious overuse of species that have economic value, is another thing that I think is important to bring up. A famous Maryland-centric example of overexploitation was the uptick in demand for oysters as more and more people from other continents came to the US. To this day, preventative measures are being taken in order for the population to remain sustainable and also collaboratively work with the economy so that those two things don't really mess each other up. Now, onto a word that I saw in the textbook and got really excited because it was mentioned verbatim on day 1, which is eutrophication, or when nitrogen and phosphorus-rich fertilizers, animal waste, and sewage seep into waterways, causing an explosive bloom of algae to conquer the area. Around where we paddle, we were in straight-up farm country. That's impossible to deny, and so countless farms near the water can contribute to this process. Now back to the extinction rate statistics for the purposes of putting things in perspective, and also because AP Statistics has a vendetta and dirt on every single school subject, including biology. So, of all species that have existed on Earth, 99.9% are extinct. And for context, background extinction is the gradual process of an organism going extinct as a result of other organisms, climate changes, or natural disasters, while as opposed to that, mass extinction is a large percent of all living species swiftly becoming extinct in a comparatively shorter period of time, and it is estimated that today's rate of extinction is about 1,000 times the normal background extinction rate, and scientists believe that we are currently in the process of another large mass extinction. All of this mixed with the impending doom that algae blooms bring is enough to prompt us to start caring about the bay and the way we drone on and on about it. What general things threaten biodiversity, you may ask? Well, let me tell you. Humans obviously do that, as I've said earlier, with such processes as eutrophication. The volatile economy does, impending disasters do that we have no control over, and habitat loss. You see, all of these should be monitored if they are quantified and able to be controlled, since everything is a human's fault and we as a society should care for where we live, and done in moderation in order to keep the sanctity of the bay's original state intact. Steps should be taken in the matter of conserving the bay. But what? Thanks for that rhetorical question, writing me. So first we're going to start off by defining the word endemic. So endemic is a species unique to one location and found nowhere else in the world. From the small amount of research that I concluded after the trip had ended, endemic and endangered species around here are the Shenandoah salamander, Maryland darter, it's a weird word, Virginia big-eared bat, dwarf wedge mussel, and sturgeon. All of these species rely on the uniqueness of the Chesapeake Bay to some degree. And a bit of a hot topic right now, maybe I'm getting this kind of confused with other things, but is the thought of renewable resources versus non-renewable resources. A renewable resource is resources that are replaced by natural resources at a greater speed than their consumption, such as solar energy, plants, animals, clean water, and clean air. But please note that does not mean that these sources are completely endless, and we should still be using them in moderation. Non-renewable resources are resources that are utilized swifter than they can replace themselves. So there's things like fossil fuels, which I'm pretty sure is the thing everyone's up in arms about, minerals, and certain species of organisms. One concept that we had to come to terms with was that the areas that we were in were left as untouched as possible, or at least any preening done to them was to make them look intact and natural. These areas helped us get a grip on what the region looked like pre-urbanization, and these areas are precious and we can't let them go because they can't reappear organically. Back on my statistics kick for this set of stats for conservation in a general sense. Setting aside regions to leave wild and not to develop them is a good idea. About 7% of the world's land is protected, and another concept I was introduced to in the textbook that we didn't talk about that I thought was interesting, not as a vocab word but just as a concept in general, is that of a hotspot, which is when there is a minimum of 1,500 species of vascular plants that are endemic and the area must have lost 70% of its original habitat for it to be considered a hotspot. The affirmation process protection spans a lot of the Chesapeake Bay, and our meager group of 13 people on a good day couldn't exactly move mountains. So, but the fact that we discuss conservation matters and perform general courtesy of picking up litter and leaving the beaches and landings better than we found them really helped. Lastly, we come to the point of restoration. So legal action, specifically the 1973 Endangered Species Act, definitely comes to mind when I think of this. And so did the two concepts, not vocab words, but just broad concepts I found interesting, of biomedication and biological augmentation. So bioremediation, sorry I mispronounced it the first time, is the use of using living organisms to remove toxins out of an area, while biological augmentation is the adding of essential items in a faltering ecosystem. So I think a relevant example to this that was mentioned briefly on our trip was when the government did a crackdown of the use of DDT in the 70s, which was prominently used insecticide. And this was because the compound was determined to be the cause of a major factor in the reason the bald eagle population was shrinking due to the fact that it weakened the shells of eggs with developing eagle chicks inside of them. Now we're on to chapter 6, chemistry and biology. Atoms are the building blocks of matter, matter being anything that takes up space, and all week we were surrounded by it and were made up of atoms, so if you think about it, this was just an atoms fest all week. Atoms are made of neutrons, electrons, and protons. And the next jumping off point into water chemistry is that of chemical bonds, otherwise known as the force keeping substances secured together. And there are two types of bonds I'm going to touch on in this chapter, just as concepts. So, covalent bonds form when atoms share electrons. An example from our surroundings were oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide, seeing as we were in the water, breathing in breathing in oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. The second kind of bond I want to talk about is ionic bonds, which are electrical attractions between two oppositely charged ions. And the biggest example I can kind of tie in was NaCl, which is otherwise known as salt. All of that abstract, intangible background wasn't pointless, I swear. It was all set up to discuss the concept of elements. Elements are defined as substances that are pure and cannot be broken down into different substances. Oxygen, mercury, and phosphorus are examples of elements found in either trace amounts or large quantities in the regions we paddled in. Oxygen, obviously, is what we were inhaling the entire week and a key component of the water that our boats were floating in. Fun fact that I learned as a result of my days as a veteran sultana camper: catfish, such as the ones that we were caught twice by the people in our group, contain mercury, which is the reason that you aren't allowed to have them on sultana overnights, because they can never be too sure if you're a fanatic of eating catfish, which is how I tied mercury into this. And lastly, this will be elaborated on later, but there were levels of phosphorus in the water, something that we were instructed to test for. It is important to note that living things are made up of primarily carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Compounds are another branch of chemistry that can be explored. When two or more elements combine, a compound results. Water is an example that's very on topic, seeing it was basically our highway the entire week. Last definition I want to bring up is chemical reactions, which are the process wherein atoms or groups of atoms in substances are rearranged into new substances. They can be naturally occurring, such as photosynthesis, or synthesized, like with the water chemistry test that we ran for the duration of the entire week. Although the actual equations of the tests that we conducted were never written down, and one quick Google search showing their obscenely complicated nature reveals why, it is important to understand the structure of chemical equations. They are written as the word reactants with an arrow in the middle pointing to products. Note that this equation is balanced, but why has it got to be balanced? Because the law of conservation of mass states that matter cannot be created or destroyed out of nowhere. Now, we're on to the core of the chemistry that we did, and for better or for worse, take your pick, marks the return of statistics. AP statistics is absolutely cackling right now. So pH is the measure of the concentration of H+, and is one of the most well-known factors in water quality. For background, pure water is a neutral, having pH of 7. Acidic solutions have more H+ and have pH values lower than 7, and basic solutions with more OH+ and pH values higher than 7 are what are considered basic. In order for homeostasis to be regulated, levels of H+ must be monitored. Buffers are mixtures added to either bases or acids intended to keep the pH in a certain range, so they help with that requirement. And now we're on to dissolved oxygen, phosphorus, nitrate, and saline tests, all in the context of water. So dissolved oxygen is the amount of saturated oxygen in a given body of water, and is an important indicator of water quality, specifically how many organisms can effectively live in the water. This is because oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, and that's what happens when you have a lot of underwater plants. The dissolved oxygen layers tend to be higher. Salinity levels. The level of dissolved salt in the water. And so, for a bit of background, fresh water is less than 1,000 parts per million, or ppm, and slightly saline water is 1,000 ppm to 3,000 ppm. Moderately salty water is 3,000 ppm to 10,000 ppm, and straight up salt water is 10,000 ppm to 35,000 ppm. Phosphorus levels, phosphorus is a major nutrient with critical roles in the formation of DNA, cellular energy in the cell membrane, and cell wall in plant cells. It is an important component to monitor, as too much of it, as stated in my definition of eutrophication, can lead to toxic blooms of algae. And lastly, there was nitrate levels that we tested for. So nitrate is an essential plant nutrient, but such is the case with phosphorus, too much of it can be detrimental to the environment of water that it's in. Earlier in this chapter, I mentioned carbon, but carbon deserves its own time to shine. Carbon is an element present in almost all biological molecules, and with carbon building and beefing up molecules, this leaves room for the existence of macromolecules, or large molecules formed by joining smaller molecules together. There are 4 major kinds of macromolecules. The first macromolecule is carbohydrates, which are intended to store energy and provide structural support. Examples of carbohydrates from this week came in the form of an edible section of a plant I believe was called arrowhead plants. I hope I'm not getting that twisted, but these plants, while not the best tasting, were a reliable staple in the diets of Native Americans due to their starchy tuber that grew underwater. And it is said that during the Native Americans' forceful removal process, they chose to be relocated to areas where this plant was absolutely abundant. Next, we're on to lipids. Lipids provide energy, provide steroids, and also act as waterproof coatings. Lipids can be hydrophobic, hence their use in waterproof coating. An amazing and adorable example of this came on Thursday when we were paddling in the marsh. We saw a couple of otters, and otters are an example of an animal that use hydrophobic lipids in its fur to waterproof. Now, there's no photos of that, unfortunately, so we're just going to make the best of it and use my guinea pig. So he's just going to just stay here and hang out for the rest of this. So the next one, we're on to proteins. Proteins transport substances, speed up reactions, give structural support, and provide hormones. The most biological comparison I could find without mentioning food here is the presence of the protein myosin in muscles. This isn't a baseless conclusion to draw, seeing as every day our muscles were being exerted in the physical act of canoeing. Lastly, we're on to nucleic acids. Nucleic acids store and communicate genetic information. So, in the terms of nucleic acid, which they were the reason that everything around us looked the way that it did, every little part of the plants and the organisms that we looked at, we saw in their natural habitat, had pre-decided appearances due to DNA, which is a very prominent kind of nucleic acid. Now we're on to Chapter 8, which is cellular energy. I sincerely hope this is the last instance of rambling for the purposes of giving background. We're going to start off by giving a couple definitions. Trust me, I'm tired of them too. Energy is a basic concept repeated so often it may become bothersome, and it can simply be defined as the ability to work. Thermodynamics are the study of how energy flows in the universe, and this comes to play when we need to evaluate how this applies in natures. Lastly comes ADP, whose long, obnoxious name is adenosine triphosphate, which is conclusively the most important biological molecule as cells store chemical energy in it. Notice these sort of bare-bone definitions. I swear that was intentional. The rubric is positively breathing down my neck, and everything has a purpose, I promise. Back to the transformation of energy track. Cells need energy to perform their basic functions. The flow of energy can be understood through thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is that energy may change form, but it cannot be created or destroyed. Basically, that ugly carp that was just yanked out of the Corsica, yeah, that didn't come out of thin air. The second law of thermodynamics, which states that systems voluntarily shift from orderly states to states of disorder. This can be exemplified by heat flow, or how energy is mostly burned off to maintain body heat, something applicable to this week, seeing as that's something we have to do involuntarily to survive. Okay, but where does all this energy come from? Another great rhetorical question written by the triumvirate of me, myself, and I. The answer? The sun. Wait, my fatigue mind tells me, but we don't photosynthesize. We tan, or we burn in the sun. Surely that isn't energy, right? Yeah, pretty much. Basically, the process is the sun goes from an autotroph to a heterotroph to a bigger heterotroph, and that is how we get energy. Now, about that dismal definition of ATP. Well, it's about to get a redemption arc. It's the most readily available energy storing molecule, and it is constructed of an adenine base, a ribose sugar, and a phosphate group. It's made of 3 phosphate groups, hence the tri and the word triphosphate. It releases energy when the weak bond between one phosphate finally shatters, making it adenosine diphosphate. ADP can change back into ATP with the addition of a phosphate. With the amount of unspoken energy saving performed during the whole week, ATP is really the unsung hero of it all. Photosynthesis is the set of reactions that convert light energy, or sunlight, into chemical energy that is utilized by the cell. Its equation is 6CO2 plus 6H2O converts to C6H12O6 and 6O2. So now it's time for the gross overcomplication of photosynthesis. So phase 1, which takes place in the thylakoid, and it is a light-dependent reaction. Photosynthesis starts when sunlight is captured, where the energy is stored as ATP or NADPH. Photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, located in the thylakoid membrane, are made up of pigments that absorb light. When light is absorbed, electrons in photosystem 2 go into an energized state. The light energy causes a water molecule to split, releasing an electron into the transport system, H plus and oxygen as a byproduct. Moving along electron carriers, the electron arrives at photosystem 1, absorbs more light, and then electrons are moved to NADP plus, forming NADPH. Phase 2, which takes place in the stroma and is a light independent reaction. It's otherwise known as the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle starts by combining CO2 with 6 5-carbon compounds to make 12 3-carbon molecules, and the energy is stored in ATP and NADPH and is given to the 3-carbon molecules. 2 3-carbon molecules leave the cycle to be used to make glucose and or other organic compounds. Ribisco, an enzyme, changes 10 3-carbon molecules into 6 5-carbon molecules to continue the cycle. Sugar formed in the Calvin cycle can be used as an energy or building blocks for carbohydrates like starch. It shouldn't be that hard to understand the correlation between photosynthesis and the trip I went on, seeing as at every location it was laden with lush and rich vegetation being autotrophic, meaning they make their own energy that isn't at the expense of other organisms, and meaning for the most part they use the sun to generate their energy. Without photosynthesis making the baseline producers, nothing else would be able to thrive in that environment. Now we're on to what I will tentatively call photosynthesis' sister, cellular respiration, or the series of reactions that break down organic molecules into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The equation for it is C6H12O6 plus 6O2 converts to 6CO plus 6H2O. Why does it look vaguely familiar? Well, it's because it's the reciprocal of photosynthesis. It's time again for the dramatic explanation of cellular respiration, broken into several clips for the sake of my sanity. Part 1 is otherwise known as glycolysis. So C6H12O6 plus O2 again equals C6CO2 plus 6H2O, and energy is a byproduct of that. It begins in glycolysis, which is an anaerobic process in which glucose is broken down into pyruvate in the cytoplasm. Following this aerobic, requiring oxygen, processes begin that break down the pyruvate into ATP. Starting with glycolysis, 2 phosphate groups are joined together to make glucose using 2 ATP molecules. The 6 carbon molecules are then broken down into 3 carbon compounds. 2 phosphates are added, and electrons and protons merge with 2 NAD plus molecules to make 2 NADH molecules and as a result, the 2 3-carbon molecules are then converted into pyruvate, and the 4 ATP molecules are created. And so now on to part 2, which is known as the Krebs cycle. 2 aerobic processes, the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, follow. First comes the Krebs cycle, where pyruvate is broken down into CO2 and ATP. Before pyruvate enters the Krebs cycle, it reacts with coenzyme A that converts it into a 2-carbon intermediate known as acetyl-CoA. Carbon dioxide is released, and NAD plus is changed into NADH. Acetyl-CoA moves to where it combines with the 4 carbon molecules to make citric acid, which is then broken down, which releases 2 molecules of CO2, 1 ATP, 3 NADH, and 1 FADH2. Acetyl-CoA and citric acid are made, and the cycle continues. 2 pyruvate molecules are made during glycolysis, resulting in 2 rounds of the cycle for every glucose molecule. And here's the final part of that process. So the electron transport chain, which is the final stage of cellular respiration. The high energy electrons and protons from NADH and FADH2 are utilized to change ADP to ATP. Electrons are passed through a series of proteins. Electrons and protons are released from NADH and FAD2 into the mitochondria and are transferred into oxygen to make water. Electron transport chain makes 24 ATP. Cellular respiration for me was important because it literally feeds into photosynthesis. Its reactants are photosynthesis products, and its products are photosynthesis reactants. Also, one of the most important conclusions I immediately drew while thinking about this project was the process of anaerobic, or not requiring oxygen, respiration, otherwise known as fermentation, lactic acid fermentation specifically. As a bit of a refresher, lactic acid fermentation occurs commonly in animal muscles in the absence of oxygen, and it is more commonly known or kind of felt as the burn when muscles are overexerted. This perfectly fits with this week, not really because of the subject matter we were learning, but because we experience lactic acid fermentation every single day when canoeing. specifically Wednesday, where I felt like my left arm was going to fall off due to the strenuous amount of paddling we had to go through at one point in the day. And now we're on to the final chapter that I'm connecting back to base studies, which is chapter 14, the history of life. Much like how Thursday's paddle was comparatively child's play in contrast to the my arms are going to fall off if I have to continue paddling on the left side, please change the side of your paddle energy Wednesday had, this chapter is a welcome break consisting of almost all vocabulary. Alternatively, it could be seen as a bit of a meek finale, but at this point I'm on the verge of finishing, and this entire chapter is tied to a very, very specific moment and location that I will keep secret until this exposition is over. Starting off with defining fossils as any preserved piece of evidence of an organism that is most commonly lodged in rock, ice, or amber. Depending on who you ask, they can also be a plot device in movies deemed as classics. But how do fossils become fossils? Are they just evidence planted by the devil so that people don't believe in creationalism? One of these is a segue to a later point, and the other one is an actual statement made by the pious priest cousin of my 8th grade science teacher's husband. Can you tell which is which? Sorry, I'm done being condescending. I'm gonna lump these next two terms sort of together in one clip. So the next term is radiometric dating, which is a method used to deduce the age of a rock using the decay of radioactive isotopes as a vehicle to come to your conclusion. This method was not done by us actively during the trip, as what we could have hypothetically dated was sort of lodged in an eroded bank we were specifically told not to chisel away at like amateur sculptures. Next, I'm really practicing my transition words here. I think I wrote too many essays this year. The geologic time scale is a model that displays the major geological and biological events of the Earth's history. Had we looked more into the ancient history of the Bay, or maybe we did, maybe it was on the day that I missed, I'd be able to pull more specific examples out of my mind, but it's not hard to imagine just how much change the Bay went through over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, now we're on to the last term of the entire project. Isn't that so exciting? The Cambrian explosion was the period of millions of years in which the ancestors of modern-day organisms began to appear and thrive. It is theorized that at some point in the Paleozoic era, ancestral fish, land plants, and insects appeared, slowly beginning a chain reaction of the immersion of tetrapods, animals that walk on 4 legs, that were also the first vertebrates. And lastly, reptiles appeared. Given that the swamps and marshes we traverse through, it isn't hard to picture the region that is now the Chesapeake Bay going through this Cambrian explosion. But what is this mysterious location I refuse to disclose, and I alluded to earlier? Well, the first place that we went to on Wednesday is aptly called Fossil Beach, and it is exactly what it sounds like. On the shore of an island, there was a narrow strip of sand with a protruding, high bank, and due to erosion, the layers of said bank had receded far enough back for innumerable impressions of fossils to be left perfectly preserved in the dried sediment. This is due to the fact that at one point, it was probably all underwater, and seeing as a lot of the fossils were all shells and or small little prehistoric fish, this was the safe conclusion to draw. But how do you become a fossil? Good question. The organism originally dies and is buried in sediment quickly, and this is much easier if you are an aquatic animal or organism. Second step is that minerals infiltrate the pores of the decomposing animal's bones or other hard areas. Step 3. On occasion, the organism decays, leaving an impression of its body. And the final step of it is, by and by, the layers harden into sedimentary rock, i.e. sandstone or limestone. Now, if we were not forbidden to try and remove the fossils for fear of furthering the already expedited erosion process, we might have actually tried to calculate how old the rocks were. But then again, how is radiometric dating used to date rocks? It is understood, of course, that you do so by using the decay of radioactive isotopes as a vehicle to come to your conclusion. But how can that be applied? As a prerequisite, know that only materials that are less than 60,000 years old can be dated accurately, as all the carbon will have decayed after that point. Carbon-14 is a commonly used isotope whose half-life is 5,730 years. After 5,730 years have elapsed, half of the carbon-14 remains while the other half exists as nitrogen-14. The sample's age can be determined by calculating the ratio of carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 in the sample. Okay, just a note before I get into the summaries, all the orders of the concepts I've listed here have changed pretty dramatically from the original outline. So these will all be a little bit different than what I originally put as that on that worksheet. So concept 1, communities, biomes, and ecosystems. Specifically section 3, which covered aquatic ecosystems. I wanted to connect this in reference to the incredible places that we paddled through And this is because Sultana made a conscious effort to take us to places that were untouched by urbanization for us to gather the true nature of what the ecosystem is like that we live in. Concept 2, biodiversity and conservation. Since said affirmations of regions are becoming more and more of a rarity, it is vital to conserve them and understand why the diverse ecosystems in them are worth saving. One point I remember, and I brought this up earlier, is Sultana counselors driving home that it would be remiss to mention the bay's struggles without acknowledging its triumphs and recovery as a result of human intervention. Concept 3, I chose to do chemistry and biology, which is water chemistry, because that became somewhat of a daily task starting on day 1, and so I wanted to take up that application we did all week and trace it back to the terms and the basics. Off the top of my head, we tested for levels of dissolved oxygen, salinity, phosphate, nitrate, and pH. All of these tests were run to increase our understanding of the facts of water quality, an important issue to keep in mind when you're studying the bay. Concept 4 was cellular energy. I chose this unit because of its innate connection to the physical act of canoeing. We canoed every day all week for at least an hour cumulatively the entire day. There were some intense patches that we had to paddle through courtesy of the wind, and even though it wasn't intentionally put into the curriculum, I thought it was a very valuable lesson to learn. And lastly, my 5th concept was fossil evidence and change. This is the shortest connection I made in reference to the beach that we visited, as it was encrusted with fossils. This prompted me to look into it further. The concept of fossilization also fit because of how it's a direct result of eroding shorelines, and that also plays into a lot of other concepts that this week had. Well, I'm going to deem that an educationally fulfilling recap. The last topic I want to throw out there for discussion is the idea of sustainability. Sustainability has the classic definition of the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level or avoidance of the depletion of natural resources in order to remain ecological balance. To me, or in layman's terms, sustainability is the practice of understanding the balance and using that knowledge to make sure something lasts as long as possible without depleting irreplaceable resources. This week, sustainability was briefly discussed, but mostly in the context of the larger ecological conservation. I'd said it a lot in this project, but Sultana made a conscious effort to take us to places that were untouched by urbanization in order for us to gather the true nature of the ecosystem that we live in. Those areas need to be sustainable so that future generations can have them, and as a frame of reference when it comes to the natural state of the bay. All I can really think is that we actively made sure that we were respectful in the areas that we visited, picking up trash when it was there before and after we left, and making sure everything we brought with us came back with us. The eluded fossil island, someone pulled out a whole cornhole game, like the wooden thing, and innumerable, almost a comical amount of tires were found the entire week, so we definitely did our part to try and make sure that a lot of trash was taken out of the water. And as a final note, I genuinely appreciate how much Sultana puts and how much care they put into sustainability. And just like that, an undisclosed amount of hours later, I am finished.